morning.
Hello.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 18 of Inside the Rookery, the finale of Season 4. I'm joined by my fellow Rooks, Andy Law, RPG designer and producer. I'm joined by writer and educator Andy Leask, and we are extremely pleased, very excited to be joined by the author Dianne Dotson to talk about a subject she knows very well, switching genres. Hi, Dianne. Really lovely to meet you.
Hi, lovely to meet you too. Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. Before we get into the questions, which as always our Discord community and our patrons have submitted online, I just wanted to pass over to you and let you introduce yourself, talk to our viewers about who you are, your work, and where we can find you online.
Great. I'm Dianne Dotson, but call me Dianne. I'm a science fiction, fantasy, and horror author, science writer, and artist. I live in Los Angeles, California, but I am from East Tennessee originally. That's where I grew up. I have a new release called The Shadow Galaxy, which is a collection of short stories and poetry out from Trepidatio, and it contains sci-fi, horror, fantasy, magical realism, and Appalachian stories. So it's a lot in a small package. And I am also a hybrid author because I have published a 4-book space opera series called The Questrazon Saga. The first book is Heliopause. The second is Ephemeris. The third is Accretion. And the fourth is Luminiferous. And that completes that 4-book set. And we will talk about how I switch among genres in that series and in The Shadow Galaxy. I also have a number of short stories published in anthologies and in magazines, and coming soon in more anthologies and more magazines. So there's a lot coming. I have another book release later in the year, which is my young adult debut, The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern, which blends science fiction, fantasy, and horror.
Can I just say, I really love the covers of those, the last 4 books you showed, but especially Ephemeris. I just think that it's just beautiful.
So this one is where this is the second book in the series, and you can tell immediately that this is quite a mix of genres right here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a spaceship and an asteroid castle, so things happen. It gets a little more exotic in the universe after Heliopause.
There we go. I'm just bringing your site up. So I will jump straight into the questions.
I think that's not the right site, just FYI.
Oh, okay. There. Okay, we'll find the right one.
It's jdiannedotson.com. Sorry about that.
No, that's our fault. I managed to get the wrong one, so we'll get the right one. So a really open and quite big question from Seagoat first. Why switch genres?
Well, I love reading a lot of genres and I love watching genres, and I feel like it was only a matter of time before I started to switch back and forth in between them as an exercise to challenge myself as a writer. And because I'm a nerd, I just really love all the genres of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Particularly those 3 are my favorite genres to write in. I also dabble a little bit with mystery in some of the books as well. And as I mentioned before with The Shadow Galaxy, a little bit of mystery and some Appalachian stories about where I grew up. So it's just fun. It's challenging, it's rewarding.
Just on where you grew up, there's a little bit of, I didn't know this, but a little bit of chat, East Tennessee, the bit of Tennessee that backed the Union in the Civil War. And some of the viewers seem to have been there myself. It's a gorgeous part of the world. So
it is beautiful.
How did your childhood inform, who you wanted to become as a writer and then what you wrote?
Oh, quite a bit. And so when I was born, we lived in basically a company town. And then my mother inherited a property out in the country. And I'm much younger than my 3 older siblings. So I'm like the baby, and they were kind of done and about to empty nest. But we moved out to the country, and that became my universe. That became sort of if Ray Bradbury had Greentown, right? I had Gray. It literally was called Gray. Gary, Tennessee. And that was a rural place in between 3 cities, the Tri-Cities of Tennessee. And I just made that my whole realm. It influenced everything I did. I I was an adventurous kid. I was always outside. You know, it was totally the 80s Stranger Things situation of riding my bike and pretending all the time. But I was a little bit lonely. And to sort of fill that void, I watched a lot of movies that I probably shouldn't have at too young an age. And I read a lot of books, some of which I probably shouldn't have too young an age. And having older siblings with Stephen King lying around, come on. But, and then also, I mean, I was right at that nerd quake that we had in the 80s of just an explosion after Star Wars, which was the first movie I remember seeing in the theater. I was 3 years old. And just everything, cartoons, movies, adventures of all kinds. Role playing was really becoming a bigger thing. And all of those things kind of mixed together in this influential cocktail for me and just seeped into me. And I wanted to make something in those worlds from an early age.
Yeah, it sounds quite familiar. A couple of us on the stream, maybe more than a couple, had a somewhat rural upbringing in which imagination was important.
It was because I was bored. We didn't have the internet. Those kinds of things. So we made our fun. It's just as my grandmothers used to say, we made our fun. Well, I made my fun too, just in a different way.
Absolutely. So Martin has asked, I guess not just your own, but literature and other fiction you've read. What have been your favorite genre switches in fiction?
I think I like the blends across various things. I have to say, and I haven't even seen it all that much, but Kroll comes to mind instantly as kind of being a good sci-fi fantasy blend. And then I love how Dragon Slayer kind of leaned into the horror aspect of dragon fantasy, which powerfully influenced George R. R. Martin, of course, with his dragons. Mm-hmm. And I love that it just went for it. You're like, oh my God, like, oh, that's scary, and I love the blend of sci-fi and horror in The Thing. John Carpenter's The Thing is one of my top films. Same thing with Alien. And that's sci-fi horror, but then Aliens comes along and you have sci-fi, action. And it's less horror, but there's a lot more going on. And so those are some of my favorites. I always love Star Wars, and it's a blend of sci-fi and fantasy, and that the Questers saga owes a lot to Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who, and the Doctor Who, which a lot of us in the US, because we didn't have BBC, we would watch old reruns of Doctor Who that would come on like public television. And so my first experience was the Fourth Doctor with his giant hair and his massive scarf. And I thought, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen, but it's kind of cool. But I only saw a little bit of it as a kid. And so it didn't have as much influence on me then as it did later in life. And now it's one of my most favorite things. And the Sonic Screwdriver of River song back there, along with a figure of the 12th Doctor in River. And so, but those are some of my favorite things. And I love His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. That trilogy is one of my most favorite, and it blends science fiction and fantasy quite well. And I think those are just the richest stories, that they have so much you can dig into on so many levels, and it's just great fun.
That's actually interesting about His Dark Materials, because if you had said to me, like, what genre is it in, I guess I would have said young adult, right? I wouldn't have said sci-fi or fantasy or horror, because young adult books kind of, I feel a little bit like they get a little bit more leeway to be anything they want and not be kind of pigeonholed into, oh, it's sci-fi or it's fantasy, because they've already got their own pigeonhole of young adult.
That's interesting, because I have a young adult book coming out later in the year, and because it's sci-fi fantasy and some horror thrown in, I'm wondering how it's going to be received. It's my first young adult novel, so that's a really good thing I hadn't thought about. Oh yeah, Aliens, The Thing, and Star Wars equals a trifecta of awesome. Yeah, pretty much.
Absolutely.
Seagoat says Star Wars is fantasy due to all the space wizards. Prove me wrong. I think Star Wars has got a bit of something you didn't mention, and that is the Wild West about it. A bit of frontier town.
Yep. Yeah. And also, I think fairy tale. It is a true American fairy tale.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And obviously all
along
the
with the Oz books. We can talk about the Oz books all day, by the way, by L. Frank Baum. But I think the Oz books and Star Wars are the first hugely American fairy tales.
I had a really weird experience with the Oz books that I've mentioned on the stream before, because growing up I didn't have a television, we didn't really watch films and TV, and so books were my window into other worlds. And just because of some random, my mum would get me books at like secondhand fairs and I would pick them up, and because of that, the first Wizard of Oz book I read was, I think, the one where there's the woman that switches heads, which was a really like weird introduction.
No, that was the Land of Oz, the Marvelous Land
the
of
Land
Oz.
of Oz.
The second one. Yeah.
And so I had no idea really what Oz was or what this whole thing
love
was.
that.
I just like fell into this.
Yeah, Princess Langwidere, and then of course in Return to Oz they combined her character with Mombi, and so that it made, in Return to Oz, Mombi was switching the heads, even though Mombi was an ugly witch in the Land of Oz, and Langwidere was a beautiful princess who liked to switch her heads because she was vain.
If I was to lean into my favorite genre switches, amusingly, they've mostly been covered. Your answer was very, very, not just concise, but it covered almost everything that I was going to say. But it
was very nerdcore.
Yeah, it was.
This is a nerd safe zone.
Tick. But I'll add, in terms of my growing up fiction in particular, I'll add Michael Moorcock, because he seems to. He approached genre fiction as if there was no such thing as genre fiction. He would flit from one thing to another, whether it was the multiversal nature of his stories and characters from one type of universe walking directly into a completely different one, or whether it was just the stories themselves and their sorcery science just as a basic starting point for, say, Hawkmoon. So for me, Michael Moorcock is way up there. It's almost like he purposely went in and went, see all of these genres that are being largely categorized for us by various publishers so that we can organize exactly where the work goes. And off he went.
Exactly. And I love that. And I love any author who does that.
Me too.
And I think like
Sorry, Andy, on you go.
Well, I was going to say, just in terms of movies as well, like my other, as well as all the movies that we mentioned before, but my other favorite movie is Blade Runner.
Oh, and God, again, that's one of those favorites.
That's got the kind of noir detective thing blended with sci-fi as well. It does make me wonder, like, all of those are like those are the iconic sort of sci-fi franchises, and they've all got something else in there as well.
Exactly.
And it's something I think we've spoken about this before in terms of Marvel movies, but the most successful Marvel movies are the ones that blend another genre. It's like Winter Soldier blending the spy genre in with the superhero. Yeah. And I wonder if there is some sort of that. Yeah. Like a magic pixie dust of genre blending.
Well, even Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of blends some genres there. You have some occult horror going on, and you have like a thriller action, but there's also this fantastical element to it all. And so I love it, because I feel like we were truly lucky to have grown up with that content in the 80s to help fuel our imaginations. It changed everything.
Yep.
Yeah, we were watching Picard last night, and no spoilers, but there was a character who appeared in Picard that had appeared in The Next Generation that was a prime example of how they sort of mix genres in The Next Generation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I do.
Yeah. I was just going to say about Michael Moorcock, I don't know if anyone else feels this. This is more of a book reading comment than a genre comment, and that is that I always feel like this sense of sorrow and loss when I reach the end of a set of books, especially ones that have been with you for a long time. Remember, like Catherine Kerr's Devery series, that I really felt a sense of loss. And what I love about Michael Moorcock is that nothing ever feels lost, because there's always like a nod back to something. There's a multiverse. You get the same characters back, but they're in a different way. So I think the book loss that you feel, you never really feel in Michael Moorcock, because it goes round in a circle.
That's an interesting thought. Yeah.
Genre flitting is a side effect of the Dewey Decimal System.
And book publicists.
Yeah. And I find fantasy and crime good fun, says Wolfsbane.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
And loosely on the fantasy and crime and fantasy and other things, it's something you often find with any established license, so a large property that's owned by someone else. When writers are hired in for it, they're often left with, well, this is the property, what am I going to do? And it's so common for them to go, well, I'll do this license, but as a Western, or I'll do this license, but as a fantasy, or as a sci-fi, or as a crime, or a noir. And it's often the case that if you've got a library full of, say, genre fiction for a particular IP, that all of the books are very, very different and are constantly not so much switching genres, but most definitely taking a great deal of inspiration from other genres, our Star Treks, our Warhammers, our whatever.
Right. Yep, that makes sense.
And obviously, fantasy and crime is a blend that, from our Warhammer work, is something that we feel a lot of affinity for.
Yeah.
So let's switch it up. So Kelishandra has asked, do you feel there are any genres that do not work well together in a single piece of work? What would you steer clear of?
Honestly, I wouldn't steer clear of anything. I say just go for it. Just have some fun. You know, you have nothing to lose, you know. Because I don't really like to pigeonhole. I'm kind of like Moorcock in that way. I'm just kind of like, no, I'm not going to restrict myself, and I'm going to tell the story I want to tell. Honestly, like, I'm loving seeing a lot of people just jump in and make whatever they want to make these days. Cozy fantasy is a great realm to have fun in, and I'm going to be playing more in that realm too. But I just love anything. Like, give me a fantasy noir, give me a romance horror. You know, I just bring it all on. There's everything works. We can make it all work.
Yeah, that. Yeah. Nothing else needs to be said. Agreed completely.
Someone's just Oxycuture said in the comments, Discworld evolved from very fantasy comedy to fantasy satire.
Kind of did.
Yeah, I could see. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Andy Leask, that is, just in terms of your work with young people and as an educator, do you see young people trying to mix genres? Does it work? Are there any big mistakes that they make that you would warn us all against?
The biggest mistake that I think younger writers make is, so the thing I keep banging on and on at them about is about like intent, in that because we're all like born storytellers, right? Like when we're all very young, like everything we say is narrative and story based, and there's evidence that we learn science better if it's expressed to us in a narrative format and everything. But then what tends to happen is that when young people are writing, sometimes they get lost in the mechanics of writing it, and so it's just then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and it becomes just a sequence of events.
And then
and getting them to stop and think the how they tell the story is as important as what they're telling, and all of that comes down to what's the intent. So how do you want the reader to feel? Do you want the reader to feel frightened there? Then you will write it a particular way. Do you want the reader to feel happy there? Then you will write it a different way. And that's something that very young writers actually get, and then they kind of lose. And then like older, like kids doing advanced higher about to go off to uni, like they get it. It's the kids in the middle who kind of forget about it and go into autopilot. But the flip side is that they are big fans of doing that, taking a story and then flipping it and doing it in a different genre. And particularly when you make them do it under pressure of like time constraints of like, you've got 40 minutes, write something. That's almost always immediately what they'll do. They'll grab the basic plot beat. Once you show them that the Lion King is Hamlet, once they see how easy it is to take a story and just translate it somewhere else, the world becomes their oyster, and they do grab back it a lot. And part of that might be because so many of them are reading young adult stuff that does have that deliberately very quite kind of loose approach to it.
Yeah, makes sense.
So Dreadlord has asked, is switching genres just another way of saying don't be confined by preconceived genres?
I mean, you could say that, but sometimes it is a deliberate choice that makes sense for the story, and it isn't a statement of don't be confined. Like I just write where the story's going to take me, and if suddenly a spaceship crashes in a fantasy land, then there's got to be a reason it did, So that's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah. And we've talked before about using like cliches and tropes as well. And that, sometimes you want to subvert those and surprise the reader. And sometimes you want to steer into them because that adds more dramatic tension. And the same, I guess, would go for genre conventions.
Dianne, when you were growing up, did you want to be an author? Like, and if so, like what kind, did you want to be a kind of author, or were you just like, I just know I want to write, I just want to be an author?
I think I've written ever since I learned my letters, and I've made little stories and little booklets. And then I was also doing artwork at the same time. So both of them evolved together, and I would illustrate what I was writing back and forth, which led to, and I've talked about this elsewhere, one of the first things I wrote was a comic called Son of Blob, and it was a comedy, right? Because I wouldn't admit that I was afraid of the 1950s movie The Blob, but I found it a little too plausible and it unnerved me. So I decided to make this little comic strip called Son of Blob to help me cope. And it was just this silly little blob with a beak and making all these different shapes in every panel and then just being ridiculous. And I had a lot of fun with that. So, but after that, I was like, I want my own Star Wars. And I kind of just went with that. And then I was being heavily influenced by a lot of the cartoons coming online, by Transformers, She-Ra, He-Man, Jem and the Holograms. The Mighty Orbots was like my favorite. I was obsessed with that show. And even the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon was a blast, so I had all of this sort of trickling in from all directions and then beginning to watch some more adult movies like The Thing and Alien. So I was like, I really want to tell my own stories. And so I was writing all the time. And I didn't stop. I did get derailed a few times when I was older because of life circumstance, but I was always writing in the margins of my life, if not, completely.
The Blob is a genuinely creepy movie. I was obsessed with Thundercats.
Oh yeah, Thundercats.
Dungeons and Dragons. Thundercats was just amazing.
Good stuff. Yep.
Yeah.
And Jem, she's truly outrageous. How can you not be obsessed with Jem?
I ranted on Twitter the other day about why don't we have holographic clothing yet? I want to sit in my sweats but look like I'm in couture.
Yeah.
The thing that exists. Come on.
100%. Synergize. Yeah.
There's some quite cool holographic technology, but so far I just happen to know this because a former colleague of mine now runs a company called Holographica, or has until recently, but all their focus is on, quite understandably, I suppose, healthcare and how it can be used, and help. So couture hasn't been their top priority so far.
One day.
Spoiler alert, apparently the D&D cartoon characters make a cameo in the new movie.
Nice.
Oh my god, that's gonna be amazing.
I need to watch that then.
That's it. I'm sold.
Talk about blending fantasy and crime as well. That's another.
Yep.
Yeah, true. So here's one from Seagoat. Seagoat has asked, do you find it easier to write for a certain genre?
No.
Do you have a home genre? No home genre, just your...
I love all of them. I love writing all of them. No, I love all of it. It's all, to me, just part of writing, and writing is sort of my oxygen. So
what is your schedule like? Is it we've had authors on before who've talked about stops and starts, and then authors who are just like, I just set myself, I do 2,000 words every day, come rain or shine, and that's what I do. Do you have a particular routine or a method?
Well, I'm the parent of 2 teenagers, and growing up, when they were babies and toddlers, that sort of derailed my schedule, because their schedule becomes paramount and you have to work around it until they get old enough to, be a little more independent. So I years ago asked Joanne Harris, author Joanne Harris, knowing that she had a child, I was like, how did you do these books? Because I want to finish these books. And how do I do it? Because I was, I'm not able to do that. She said, you carve out the time. And I finally just took that and I was like, okay, I'm going to write when I can write, and I'm going to run and just do it when I can. And so I'm not the kind of person who writes X number of words per day. I feel like I can skip a day, but I'm a very fast writer. And so some days I write many thousands of words.
Yeah.
And, I've written, in the past year, I wrote 2 full-length novels within 2 months each, because I'm a fast writer, and each of them was at least 90,000 words. So, and I was, in addition to that, doing my day gigs of science writing and parenting and all this stuff. But when I sit down and I write, and I don't beat myself up over not making a certain word count a day. The deadlines that I impose are the ones that I impose on myself. I'm in competition with myself. And, of course, if my agent needs something by a certain time, I'll make sure it gets there, but for now, same with editors. I think, though, I'm a little unusual in my speed because I am a science writer and I'm used to article deadlines being very fast, and you have to get those in. And you sort of ingrain that deadline into your fiction writing. I've noticed with another couple of friends of mine who were journalists, who are very fast, prolific writers. And we all have that sort of feeling of like that tension, that sweat. We're like, oh God, we gotta get this done, you know? So then we're able to write a lot more because we're under our mental sort of self-imposed deadlines. But absolutely, I will take time off from writing and I will not feel guilty about it, and nobody should.
Yep.
Yeah, we've had a couple of journalists who've later then got into fiction writing, and they've all really said the same thing, that they had just got used to that being their work day, and it gives them a different relationship with writing than, say, someone who has never been a journalist and becomes an author through a different route.
And I'm appreciating that more because I took for granted that I had that fire under me, and a lot of authors don't have the journalism background. They don't feel the same fire. And to me, it's just like, I got to get this done. You know, I've got stuff to do, you know, and that, I don't mean to project that like anybody should be that fast. In fact, I think the opposite. I think I could benefit from slowing down. And, you know, my husband, Gareth L. Powell, is an author, and his style is very different from mine. And his writing, he writes what he writes a day, and, you know, he makes it beautiful and lived in and perfect. I'm not that way. I come in and I crash land and I blast it out and I fix it in post. You know.
Oh wow, that's a little bit too close for comfort. Yeah, Andy,
I feel seen.
Very seen. Andy and I often write together, and our mantra is, yeah, we'll fix that in post. As a small aside on the whole writing and creating as a parent, we're also parents of teenagers, and that process. Yeah, quite. Our oldest is now at university though, so yay. That made an enormous difference. But there was that period when they were very young. Where your time just vanished. Where you're
exhausted. You're so exhausted.
Where I remember, I keenly remember, I had a deadline about 4 days away. And I had both, I think, about 8,000 words left to write and 2 maps to do for novels, because I'm a cartographer as well.
Oh my God.
So I ended up on my computer downstairs in what was my basement with my baby on my lap, bouncing my leg up and down to keep her asleep. As I was tapping away with one hand, and as I reached a mental exhaustion on the writing, going right over to the pad and started drawing on the pad.
Right.
And I left Lindsay to sleep through in the other room, and she was completely exhausted. And then she came through about 2 hours later, went, "I'll do the baby now," and I was like, "I think I'll sleep."
Yeah,
it was tough, fun.
Yeah, whereas so I wasn't in a creative job then. So my day job is in banking. So about a year or so later, I started a master's, and we did a different approach. So I would just say to Andy, or he'd say to me, like, just instead of coming home at 5, come home at 7:30, 8 o'clock, and I would just stay at work and write my dissertation, just like on the end of my work day. So there's ways you can do it, but I think it's very much more helpful if, well, children are raised by a village, if there's at least a couple of you, if not a whole village.
Right. Yeah.
Gareth is in the chat. Gareth is in the chat, by the way, Dianne.
Oh, I haven't even looked at them.
No, don't worry.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
okay.
he's
given
us a few
good quotes. Hi, everybody. I'm just now looking at your comments. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I'll bring them up on screen. You don't need to look at them.
Don't worry about it.
Sorry, Rangel and I have been chatting about books. Sorry.
Yeah, I can see some of them pop up, but not all of them.
So I think I'm probably bringing up Rangdo's comment, and it's probably part of an ongoing conversation with you in the chat, Andy. There's a really good German novel about a quasi-immortal secret policeman, although it's never really explained why, or even if he's really immortal. He just works from every secret service from Wilhelmine, Germany.
I love that.
That's pretty cool.
I've
never read that one. I've never even heard of that one. No. That sounds awesome.
That's kind of Orlando. So there's some characters in the Questers on Saga that I'm having next year. I'll talk about this later. I'm going to have a short story collection based in the Questers on Saga universe, and it's going to explore more about the other ageless beings and what they've been doing around humanity. And so that dips a little bit into that kind of stuff.
So Kilishandra had asked, really interesting to hear your views on this. How important is it to telegraph early that you've changed genres, or can you just trust the reader to realize this over time? Or I guess I would add a follow-up question: does it even matter? If you're telling your story.
I guess that matters. It matters to different authors in different ways, right? I think in my case, I trust the reader, and I just go for it, and that might be a little controversial, but that's just my style, and every writer has a different style, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, it's like the funnily enough, in terms of young people, I was literally talking about this with my students when they came to writing this week, about Chekhov's gun, and that whole thing about, if you've got the gun on stage, you owe it to the audience for it to have gone off by the end of the play. And I'm like, I kind of accept a modified version of that, which is either you owe it for them to have gone off, or you owe it for them to have almost gone off and then not for a reason that is integral. So, you either need a climax or an anti-climax, but you need a payoff one way or another.
Yeah.
And I guess it's a bit like that with genre. The only risk of not telegraphing it, I suppose, is if the audience doesn't expect the tonal whiplash. But like you say, more often than not, I think if you trust the reader, they're more likely to go with you. So
right. And sometimes the whiplash is intentional.
Yeah. Like that's the point. Yeah.
Right. Sometimes you're like, oh shit, well, I didn't see that coming, and that happens a lot in some of my stories. And, every taste in the reader is different. Like some readers may not like that. And I appreciate that, but I'm going to write when I'm going to write. It's just the way it is.
As a little addition to that one, Weiss and Hickman, who wrote a lot of the D&D novels back in the 80s and 90s, they did themselves a trilogy called the Dark Sword trilogy.
I love that trilogy.
Oh, there we go. Someone else has read it. And it is classic fantasy to its core, with its own little magic system as you'd expect, and its own little world building as you'd expect. And right now, if you don't like spoilers, cover your ears. I'm giving you warning. It's an old book, but spoilers are coming. At the end of it, tanks rolling from Earth. It's completely crazy. It was a massive tonal whiplash. And for some people, it absolutely worked. And they were like, this is the best thing ever. But for others, it was such a shock to the system. Because there was no build up.
Life of Brian.
Yeah.
Quite.
Exactly. Or Blazing Saddles. Yeah.
Or Blazing. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You need a UFO crashing in and be like, what the hell is this?
We've got the first book of the Dark Sword trilogy sitting in our massive collection of books.
Nice.
Yeah. I was putting some stuff in storage before Christmas and I found it, so I had a quick read of it, and it was really funny to see. There's a character in it that I could see like a direct line from that character to some, characters that you've introduced later in your role-playing games, Andy. Yeah, you probably
cool.
don't even realize that there's one in there.
Oh yeah. That's cool.
Yeah,
it is.
So I was just going to bring up a comment about so I do love short stories and short story collections. Some of the stories in fiction that have had the most impact on me are short stories. I remember, I don't know if it was because my English teacher knew something about my attention span, but she was amazing. Miss Spence, we loved her so much. She was the best teacher I've ever had. Well, Mr. Innes was good too for history, but Miss Spence, we loved her so much. And she gave me a collection of sci-fi short stories. And they had things like Dark They Were and Golden Eyed by Ray Bradbury and
Ray Bradbury, nice.
Yeah. And they, each of them for different reasons, just like grabbed me and kind of never let go. Like I've never forgotten them in a way that I've maybe forgotten other books I've read, because they were so perfectly formed, and the point they were making was it was like right there. And Print Crime was a really good one about templates for printing and how it had become a crime to share these templates, and it was all about 3D. You could print washing machines and print fridges, and it was all about someone who was pirating these templates. And it's always stuck with me, because as the years have gone by, I've seen the world catch up with that author's idea, and I think that's so fascinating.
It is. Oh God, I love writing short stories, and Bradbury and King are big influences on that for me. But I just and of course that's one reason I have this, and I have more coming, and I've got short fiction out in the world, is because I love the challenge of short fiction, and I love the different things that you can do with it. It's incredibly creative work.
And I did want to ask you about your science writing. Do you find that gives you ideas, that sparks sort of creative ideas for your fiction?
Mm-hmm. It does. And interestingly, so when I was growing up, I had a strong English, science, and art trifecta. I was always outdoors all the time, and I was obsessed with astronomy. And I even made my own astronomy club when I was 10. The other kids my age did not. I was the weirdest person they'd ever know. So, but I even had a newsletter, and I still have these somewhere, and they're hilariously ridiculous. But I would be talking, and this was back in the early 80s, about exoplanets around nearby stars. And I talked about the Centauri system, and I would illustrate, and it'd be like demonstrating, well, what would aliens be like in this system? And so when I grew up and went into college and decided, I sort of wibble wobbled back between sort of pre-med, pre-vet stuff, but switched over to ecology and realized how fascinating that was. And so I really like incorporating that into my fiction. And I've written an article on the SFWA website about the ecology of world building that anybody can go and read. And it's for any genre. And, it sort of breaks it down, like, how can we use ecology for science fiction, for fantasy, for horror? And so it's kind of it's a waypoint for everybody to be thinking about world building in terms of those terms. That was redundant. Anyway, but at the same time, when I was working on this one article about feather stars a couple of years, I guess it's been like 3-4 years ago, for a job. And that article's still online somewhere. I have on my website a lot of science writing articles linked. So thank you for the link. There's the link to the SIFWA article on ecology and world building. On my website, you have science writing articles that you can go down through. And I apologize if any of them are out of date, but there's a lot there of lots of different subjects. And with the feather stars, it kind of bled into a character that I made up in Accretion called Prince Haskanot. And he's an interesting being from the Mahelkian system. And he has on his head, hidden with the turban, he's got these interesting feather star appendages that are part of his telepathic power. Thank you. You found the feather star article. Cool. So that was an example of like, oh, this fits this guy perfectly. I already knew about the prince and his weirdness, but I was like, what is it about his physical appearance? And so there's also on my website, I have on my blog a ton of character illustrations that I've commissioned, or that, a few that I've done myself, but many commissioned in terms of all these different characters. You could see them. So for Prince Haskanot, you can see on his, let me see. Do you want me to I can find the link. Let me find the link and I'll put it in the chat for comments. And I will see.
So just while you're doing that, Zoltan says we will need a list on the Discord of all of these books. Yes, challenge.
Okay, I think
Andy Leask has just saluted, and I take that as the international sign language to mean challenge accepted.
All right. Okay, so how do I add to the comments?
If you put it in private chat, I can copy it.
Okay, great. All right. So here's a link to Prince Haskanot.
Excellent.
And how he looks without the turban on his head.
Here we go.
Nice.
So, so if you go under the art category on my blog, you just scroll back for pages and pages of the character art from the Questers saga. I've got all kinds of aliens, humans, aliens that look like humans, ageless beings, robots. They're all there. It's a fully realized universe that I've spent decades working on, and it's so much fun.
Nice.
I'm a nerd. Can you tell?
Yeah, that's just the way it should be. It's good fun.
Do you find when we were writing Warhammer, we had played in that world in Warhammer Fantasy for literally decades. And so the three of us were writing that together. And quite often, Andy Law, who was the producer, would ask Andy Leask and myself for something. And it wouldn't be so much making it up as writing memories of things we'd experienced or things we'd thought about in that world. Do you find that you've got to that stage where it's almost so fully realized that you're writing things you already know rather than things you're making up at that moment?
It does feel like that. So when I was a kid and I started world building, my space opera, I I had written 2 full-length novels by the time I was 14. And so the first one I had written at 13, and the second one, that's not my art. That is commissioned. I do have some of my art on my website. If you want me to show you that, I can. But let me finish the thought, and then I'll get back to the art.
Yeah.
So that was the bones of the Quest Resistance Saga. I had finished these 2 books. I had illustrated the characters in their crazy galactic fashions. And my English teacher took it upon herself to reach out to publishers on my behalf at that young age. And we did hear back from Berkeley Publishing Group, and they wrote a letter, and I have a picture of it on my blog somewhere. They were like, well, even though you're very young, if you're serious about this, here's the guidelines, but you might want to continue to hone your craft. But if you want to do this, but I kind of chickened out. But then I realized I had made an intense world. I had travel guides, I had species guides, I had illustrations for this universe back in the 80s. So this was becoming like almost in my DNA at that point. And it continued to be that. And the character of Ariad, the space mage, I dreamed him. And there's actually an actual passage in Ephemeris that is verbatim the dream that I had about when he took me up to his sky palace and what happened there. So yes, English teachers are great, Mark.
Yes, we are.
And she was an English and science.
100%.
She was an English and science teacher. So she was powerfully influential on me in ways that I'm only now really beginning to realize. But so, yeah, I mean, these characters helped me through a lot. You know, they became very real to me. The worlds I made became hyper real. When you read Luminiferous, especially, I'm going back to some of that original story and fleshing out that little boarding house, the Gendus, where Gala ends up coming after this epic and horrific journey to wind up on this hidden planet, Quopea, which I came up with when I was 13. And all these species, you know, the Bulbenberries, the Gendu himself, and all these other characters, Onioti, the android, Dimitron, the Star City. I made those so long ago that they're so ingrained in me that, you know, those are worlds I can quickly just disappear back into and feel like they feel real. And I'm hoping that they feel real to readers as well.
Well, Seagoat said this is like the top compliment that you can get, Dianne, is a proper nerd.
I love it.
I love it. This is brilliant. I'm gonna ask our oldest, Andy and I's oldest, to watch this stream, because I think she'll get a lot out of it. Because she phoned me today and we were chatting, and she said, "Oh, do you remember this character I created? You know, when I was 13 or 14? Well, she was always meant to be older, but you know." I realized that when I drew her and when I created her, she looked 13 or 14. So I've redrawn her, and she sent me the link to how she looks now. And I was like, she really does look like she's grown up. So
yeah, that happened a lot with my characters too, illustrating and writing them. Yeah.
Yeah. Her and her sister have this whole world that they've been playing together since they were 7 or 8. And we really hope that one day we'll see the fruits of that labor. Play.
I bet we will.
Yeah.
Hey, there's Laura. My agent Laura is in the chat at Lost Bennett, and so hi, it's so great that I found an actual other proper nerd to be my agent, and and we can talk about the book that is on submission a bit if you would like. And I would love that. Definite genre blending book.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before we talk about that, I just wanted to ask, have you ever thought about turning your world into a role-playing system?
Yes, many times. And it's been suggested that I do as well. And I would love it. And also another thing that I did, I remember I mentioned I had travel guides for the Quest of Song. This was when I was a kid. I also made maps, and I've updated some of those. So I really wanted the whole system. I wanted it all. And it absolutely would be an amazing role-playing game. You could play all these different species at different points in time, at different points in the galaxy. And it just would be an absolute blast.
I ask because I think it sounds like it would be amazing.
It would be awesome. Like, and I do kind of want to do that, but I don't really know how to get that going. But I feel like, oh, Laura, totally. I would want you to do that. Yeah, honestly, if we want to do that, I'm down. Like, because it's all there. I have, and in the back of the later 3 books of the Questions on Saga, also just to nerd out. This is a little feature. I have a pronunciation guide.
Yes. That's the best. Yeah, you're speaking to the right people about RPG systems.
I feel like we've
designed them for a living.
Now. We're all friends now.
Yeah, we're all friends now. Yeah, I'm working on a new one right now. Actually, it's lots.
All right.
Fun. Yeah, good times. You almost want to go.
Anyway, yep.
Hi, Laura. Hi, guys.
Hi, guys. This is so sweet. They're talking.
Getting all here. All right, Laura.
Yeah.
Call my agent. I'm gonna call you.
So let us get back to what we were going to talk about, which is the book. So talk to us about the let me just take this question off the screen. Sorry, I was getting distracted by all the call my agent.
We're having lots of fun here.
Yeah. Oh, actually, just before we do that, Mark, when the comments says this sounds like a good point to ask, would it be a genre switching RPG? I mean, it certainly could be.
I think that would make a really nice little, not necessarily a chapter, but in say a GM section where you've got some guides for how people could run the game. You could explain different genres and how they could be expressed within the setting. I think that would would very much move into the discussion we're having here very well.
Yep.
Yeah, I can see how that'd be written. Yeah. Anyway, I'm getting lost in game design now in my head.
So anyway, back to the book.
Which book? The Shadow Galaxy, or
yes, okay. The Shadow Galaxy. Yeah.
All right. So the Shadow Galaxy is my new collection, and in it I have different sections: Shadow Shores, Tales from the Sea; Other Futures, Tales of the Galaxy in a Place Called Earth; Into the Darkest Hollow, Tales of Horror; Love and Other Moments, Traces of the Heart; Far Appalachia, Tales from the Ancient Mountains; and Resonant Thoughts, some poetry. There's a little bit of poetry in the back, and including one I sent to Ursula K. Le Guin, and she wrote me back.
Oh, lovely.
So
nice.
That's really cool. So this book is a culmination of literally decades of poetry and stories, some of them quite new and some of them quite old, that I found in a binder from the 90s. But this is Scarlett Algie, the editor at Trepidatio, just snagged the thing, just instantly loved it. And it's got stories that some of them are resolved, some of them are a slammed door, and that's intentional. And sort of that, I think it's epiphanic fiction. Ray Bradbury really loved to swim in that. And so when you reach the slam door, that's Ray Bradbury waving from the beyond saying, atta girl. So, because I loved how some of his stories are quite terrifying. So The Strangler in Greentown, that when it was a short story and it ends abruptly, you're like, oh shit, she's dead, Yeah. But then you read Dandelion Wine, and I'm not going to spoil what happens next, but that is one of my most favorite books of all time, partly because it's a genre switcher, because the magical realism of Dandelion Wine is so magnificent and so transporting that I had an honorarium situation with a university in Texas last year, and I wanted the class to read Dandelion Wine because of the description and the world building that was not in a necessarily genre book, but you can do that in any fiction to help transport the reader. It's so beautifully written, and like many of Bradbury's stories. So this is heavily influenced by Ray Bradbury, Stephen King, but also it's just me on a very crystallized personal level. Some of it painfully personal, some of it grief from my father when he passed away 3 years ago. My mother just passed away last month, and that is going to, I'll be honoring her in my fiction as well. So both of them so essential to my work, that I recently said on Twitter, I'm like, I don't know who I'm doing this for anymore. I did it for them. And they were so celebrating of all 4 of us kids and all our different strengths and flaws, and Dad was a storyteller, just tell you a story, drop of a hat, on his world travels. And he was also an indie author. And then my mom worked at a printing press. So it was always going to happen. Right. I was going to get books out there by hook or by crook, so to speak. And with this book, I feel like it's just such a good culmination of what I can do and hints at what's coming, because there's at least one story in here that is going to be a novel. There could be more, and we're trying to keep track. Oh, thank you, Sea Goat. I'm just doing it because, like I said earlier, writing's my oxygen, and I don't think I could stop if I wanted to, and I don't want to. It's just that sometimes you can, and you need to take a break. And after my book tour is over, I'm taking a break. And then, Laura, I will be finishing that novel and getting it to you in May.
Especially if you've been through something so painful and heart-wrenching recently as losing your mum. It's easy to get swept up in work and just do the things that feel comfortable and do the things you've always done, and not take that time to really grieve and take time for yourself.
I'm feeling it in my body, that my body's going, you need to stop. But I'm going to get through the book tour. And one part of it that was cathartic was that I was last weekend, Gareth was here at the time. We went to Salt Lake City, where I had never been, but I have a lot of cousins there. And my mom's sister, Patsy, lives there. And I had not seen her in like 15 years. And my cousin Wes flew down from the Northwest and drove me and Gareth to see her. And we just had this wonderfully cathartic hugs. And then another cousin brought out old pictures, stuff I'd never seen of my mom as a young girl. And it was just really good. And I feel like it was Wes's idea to do part of the book tour there. And I'm like, thank God he did, because that needed to happen. I felt like as tiring as all of this has been, and as weird as doing a book tour, I was able to connect with my family in a different way. And Gareth got to meet some of them too. But you got to take that time. And I see that whip crack, Laura. So my plan is like after the book tour, because I got another couple of things coming up. I've got a signing this afternoon, and I've got a signing tomorrow at WonderCon, and I have a book signing at Barnes & Noble in a couple of weeks. But after that, I'm going to sit on the beach and stare at the water and do nothing else. And then I'm going to get back to writing.
I'm really fascinated by all of the different subtitles in that book, but especially it'll come no surprise to regular viewers to know that I'm really interested in the Appalachian, is it folklore? Is it I don't know anything about Appalachia.
Okay,
what kind of things will be in there?
Lesson number 1, everybody listen up. It's Appalachia.
Appalachia. Okay, thank you.
Because that's a big, Appalachian sounds like a wine region, It
does.
No shade. But we in Southern Appalachia, we call it Appalachia.
Noted.
So, and it's going to take a while before a lot of people, but I'm ready to take on that mantle and make sure. But what's interesting to me and really rewarding is the response I'm getting to the Appalachian stories. And that tells me that is so personal and so close to me that I need to dig in more into that. And there is a middle grade book that I have in progress. We're not doing anything yet with it, but it's set in Southern Appalachia. And I think I need more stories in that area, because a lot of people have this very stereotypical view of Southern Appalachia, of East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, West Virginia, Western North Carolina, Eastern Kentucky, Northern Georgia. Yeah, that Southern Appalachian area, in which was quite an isolated area for a long time, and in which is like almost a series of islands in which unique dialects were on each mountaintop. And a lot, there's a Scots-Irish huge influence there. There were the Cherokee, and before they were on the Trail of Tears, there's a very interesting legacy there. And Dolly Parton's from there. What more can you say in praise? But they have Dolly Parton hailing from Southern Appalachia, fellow Tennessee queen. So there's a lot of down-home stories, music, food, but a lot of legends. And I like, one thing that I'm playing with is this sort of feeling that there's these mountains are older than the rings of Saturn. They are the oldest mountains on Earth. And there is something deeply mysterious about them that is almost like spiritual isn't the right word. There's something elemental going on there, something that you can feel when you are there coursing through you. And I'm a woman of science. I'm not a woo-woo person, but this is there's something going on there that I'm trying to tap into and reveal. And if you want to read something scary set there, because I've got some tales of delight and horror set in Appalachia, but something scary that's a short story I wrote from Janus Literary. It's on their website, Night on Preston's Bald. And that is a cosmic horror set in Appalachia. And you can find that online and read it for free. And it's scary. So, but there's, so in this book, not actually in the Appalachian section, but the tunnel at the end is also set in East Tennessee. And it's based on a real tunnel in my hometown where if you go in that tunnel, which is very tiny, and at night you can hear screams from someone who's murdered, so that's stolen that from that completely. And then, Rotor, which is the robot romance story, which is kind of a showcase in this book, a very touching story, is set in Appalachia. And of course, but when I get back to Mr. Gerald, that's a true story, just with the names changed. And of course, even Sourwood Honey Days was a real thing. Tracks in Autumn, that's real. That's not fiction. But The Queen and the Mountain Laurel is me and Dad, in a magical realism setting. That's totally us. And my cousin just read it the other day, and she goes, I can hear you and your dad in this story. And that really touched me. So those stories are important to me. And I would like to write more about the region and my life there.
Mark has asked, have you read Manly Wade Wellman's Silver John stories?
I have not.
It says they're pulp Appalachia.
Oh,
hopefully I pronounced that right.
Thank you.
Yeah, good old Ulster Scots and hillbilly culture.
Yeah,
I was talking to a friend of ours who's a writer in LA, and he was saying when we were talking about some Scottish folk songs that he could hear that link between, and it turns out he was talking about the area that you're from, just coincidentally.
Yep. Mm-hmm. He was.
Yeah, and the distinctive dialect and some of the vocabulary that had been retained from Scots that wasn't retained anywhere else in the US.
It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Seagoat says legends and horror stories from Appalachia are really engrossing.
Yep.
Oh, interesting. Some of them have a Celtic origin, from what I heard when the settlers arrived. And Mark also said there's already a suitable RPG. Old Gods of Appalachia has a cipher system RPG.
Yeah, I'm aware, but I've never dipped into that yet. So, but it is pretty interesting.
So we're almost coming to the end of our hour. So I'm just going to see, we've got one final question, and then we can talk again about what you've got coming up next, where our viewers can find you, and what if our viewers are new to your work, what would you suggest they read first?
First of all, Seagoat, thank you. He says that they've said, I just ordered the Shadow Galaxy. Thank you very much. Introducing readers to my work, perhaps this is the answer, because it is a collection and it shows my range, and I am not going to stop expanding that range. I want to do some noir. I want to do some mystery, and interweave that into everything too. So this is a good place to start, and it supports, if you want to support an indie bookseller. If you don't, I don't judge, but I would love for readers to get this, because this is my traditional debut. And, the more people who find this book and love it and hopefully review it, the more likely more of these stories can come out, and if you want to read my indie space opera books, they're pretty well rated. And Heliopause is the first one. And this takes place at the edge of our solar system at the Heliopause in the future, 23rd century. Ephemeris is the second one, and things get a little more exotic as you start to see what's going on out in the galaxy. Accretion is the third, and Luminiferous is the fourth. And I do have on my website a book page that you can go and look at all of these, and also an anthology I'm in of a cozy winter fantasy story. I have an anthology. So those are the ways to find me, but I would start with the Shadow Galaxy. That would be great.
Brilliant. And that's released in the UK and in
everywhere,
worldwide. Perfect. Great. You heard it here. Go and buy the Shadow Galaxy. And here we'll just pop the link up for Diane's website at the end.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Your agent says Laura's off to play virtual board games after. We found you. We found our people.
Yeah.
Sorry I didn't get here sooner. I really enjoyed what I've watched.
Thank you, Laura.
You enjoyed it. You can come back anytime, Dianne. We would love to have you on, and hear about what you do next. And if if you ever do plan an RPG, then we would love to hear about that as well.
I may have to pick your brain on that one and see how to get that going, because that would be a lot of fun.
Andy is your man, so we'll set you up.
Great.
He can call your agent too. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to hear about your work, to get to know you, and thanks for sharing some really sort of personal stories. Really amazing. This is, as I said, this is the last episode of this season. We'll be back later on in April for next season. But until then, thank you to all our patrons.
I have something I'd like to add as well.
And Andy, I believe if you had given me time.
I jumped in too early.
You did. What would you like to say?
I would like to say that between the two seasons, I'm doing some mapping tutorials for our patrons. I'm doing a set of tutorials to explain how to do the basics of cartography. So there's going to be 7 different tutorials for mountains, 7 different tutorials for forests, 7 different tutorials for how to do location markers. And I'm going to be drawing upon the various professional maps that I've made for different settings, ranging from the Game of Thrones right through to Warhammer 40,000, Critical Role stuff. And I'll be dragging from each of them and showing you how I did each of them in a step-by-step process. The first one is next Wednesday, and that's for our Brazen Rooks and above. So if you're interested, go sign up to our Patreon as a Brazen Rook. It's only £5, €5 British pounds. And you'll get access to that tutorial. It'll run for an hour next Wednesday. Then the Wednesday after that, I'll do another one. And the Wednesday after that, I'll do another one. And the Wednesday after that, I'll do yet another one for a total of 4 special tutorials. So it's going to be lots of fun. Hopefully see you there.
Thank you so much, Andy. And thanks, Dianne. Thanks to Andy's. Thank you to everyone who's watched us today. And until the next season, let's just finish this season with a big rookery. Caw-caw! Caw-caw!
Thank you so much.